Your phone rings. An unfamiliar number, no name attached. You answer, and a pleasant, slightly staticky voice says, "Hi, can you hear me okay?" It's such a small, ordinary question that most people answer it exactly the way they'd answer it from a friend with a bad connection. "Yes, I can hear you." That's it. That's the entire call sometimes, a few seconds of pleasantries, and then a dial tone. Or the caller fumbling something about a bad headset before hanging up entirely. And for almost a decade now, warnings from the FCC, the Better Business Bureau, and state attorneys general have told you that single word, recorded, can be used to authorize charges on your credit card without your knowledge. You've probably seen this warning shared by a relative on Facebook, mentioned on the local news, or repeated by a well-meaning neighbor at some point over the past several years. I want to tell you something today that I don't think enough channels covering this topic are willing to say plainly. That specific claim, the part about your recorded yes legally authorizing a credit card charge, isn't actually true, and I think you deserve to know exactly why, along with what the real risk in this call actually is, because it's still worth taking seriously, just not for the reason most warnings describe. I'm Henry Collins. Every week on this channel, I break down exactly how scams work, mechanically and legally, so you understand not just what to watch for, but why it actually works or doesn't. Today I want to walk through one of the most widely repeated warnings in the scam awareness world. Take apart the legal claim sitting at the center of it, show you what's actually real underneath it, and then tell you exactly what to do the next time you hear that question on the other end of the line. Let's start with the myth exactly as it's usually told, because I think it's worth stating clearly before taking it apart, the same way I'd want any claim examined before I repeated it to my own family. The claim goes like this. A scammer calls, asks a question designed to get you to say the word yes, records your voice saying it, and then uses that recording, sometimes spliced into a different conversation entirely, to authorize a purchase on your credit card or a new charge on your phone bill, claiming afterward that you gave verbal consent. This version of the story has been repeated by news outlets, consumer protection offices, and yes, plenty of scam awareness channels, going back to at least 2017, and it keeps resurfacing every few years as though it's a fresh threat, rather than the same warning recirculating, sometimes with a new city attached to the same story, sometimes with a slightly different phrase the caller supposedly used. Here's the problem with it, and I want to walk through the actual law rather than just asserting this, because I think the reasoning matters more than the conclusion, and because I want you to be able to explain this to someone else with confidence rather than just repeating a talking point. Federal law defines what counts as a valid electronic signature, and it requires two specific things. First, the recording or signal has to be clearly connected to a specific contract or transaction, not a general phrase floating loose in a conversation. Second, and this is the part that matters most here, the person has to give that response with clear intent to agree to that particular thing. The statute itself describes an electronic signature as a sound, symbol, or process attached to a specific record and executed with the intent to sign that record, which is a much narrower legal bar than most people assume it is. Answering yes to "can you hear me?" satisfies neither requirement. You weren't presented with any terms. You weren't told what you were supposedly agreeing to. Your actual intent, in that moment, was to confirm you could hear a phone call, nothing more. The same intent you'd have answering that exact question from your own daughter on a bad connection. A recording of you saying yes to that specific question with no contract, no terms, and no informed consent attached to it doesn't meet the legal bar for authorization under the law, no matter how convincingly a scammer might later claim otherwise. Most states have also adopted their own version of a law called the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act, which reinforces the same basic principle at the state level, requiring that both parties actually agree, knowingly, to conduct a transaction electronically before any electronic signal can bind either of them to anything. I also want to mention something that consumer protection researchers have pointed out repeatedly when they've dug into this specific warning. Despite this exact scam scenario circulating in news coverage for close to a decade, investigators have had real difficulty finding a single confirmed, documented case where a recorded yes alone was actually used to successfully authorize a fraudulent credit card charge. One well-known fact-checking organization went looking specifically for a real, verifiable instance of this exact scenario playing out and came up empty, finding only second-hand references to the warning itself rather than anyone who could describe having actually lost money this specific way. The director of victim support at one of the largest consumer fraud tracking organizations in the country has said plainly that their own database contains no cases of significant monetary loss tied directly to this specific mechanism, no reports of anyone losing tens of thousands of dollars or even a few $100s, purely because a recorded yes was used against them in the way the warning describes. That's a meaningfully different picture than the one most warnings paint, and I think it's worth sitting with for a moment because it changes how urgently you actually need to fear this exact call, even while the underlying caution around it remains worth keeping. It's also worth asking a simple, practical question that rarely comes up in the original warnings, which is why a scammer would even need your actual recorded voice in the first place. If the goal were simply to claim you'd verbally authorized a charge, a scammer could just as easily type that claim into a dispute form or tell a story to a customer service representative without any recording at all. Banks and credit card companies don't maintain databases of customer voice recordings that get checked against incoming authorization claims in real time, which means the recording itself doesn't actually add any real leverage to a fraudulent claim in the way the myth implies. That gap in the logic is part of why researchers who've looked closely at this warning have struggled to find it holding up under scrutiny. So if the credit card authorization piece isn't the real threat, why does this call keep happening over and over for years? Clearly at some real scale, with real money and real operations clearly behind it. Here's what's actually going on, and it's less dramatic than the myth, but genuinely still worth protecting yourself against. The first real purpose behind this call is simply confirming that your phone number is active and reaches an actual human being willing to engage with an unknown caller. That sounds almost too mundane to matter, but in the world of telemarketing fraud, a confirmed live number, one where a real person answers and responds, is a valuable commodity, genuinely more valuable than an unverified number sitting untested in a database. Lists of confirmed live numbers get bundled together and sold to other telemarketing operations, some legitimate, many not, specifically because a number known to reach an engaged person is worth far more than a random, unverified number pulled from a phone book or generated randomly by dialing software. Every time you answer and respond to one of these calls, even briefly, you may be adding your number to exactly that kind of list, which tends to result in more calls of every kind arriving in the following weeks, not fewer, a slow, compounding increase in robocalls that most people never connect back to the single "can you hear me" call that started it. The second real risk, and this one is genuinely documented and genuinely illegal, is something called cramming. This isn't about your credit card at all. It's about your phone bill. Cramming happens when a third-party company places charges directly onto your phone or utility bill for a service you never actually ordered, often disguised as something vague, like a voicemail service, a directory listing fee, or a premium messaging subscription, small enough that plenty of people never notice it buried among dozens of other line items on a monthly statement that most of us skim rather than read line by line. Phone carriers are required by federal regulation to investigate and reverse these charges once identified. And this is the piece of the Say Yes story that has real documented cases behind it, phone bill charges appearing without authorization rather than credit card fraud specifically. It's a real illegal practice, one that's cost consumers genuine money over the years, and if it's ever happened to you, you're entitled to dispute it and get it removed. usually within a single phone call once you know to look for it. The third real risk, and honestly the one I think deserves the most attention going forward, has nothing to do with the original version of this scam at all, and everything to do with how much the surrounding technology has changed since this warning first started circulating years ago. A recorded sample of your voice, even a single short word, is exactly the kind of raw material that voice cloning tools can now work from. These tools have become dramatically more capable and dramatically cheaper to access in just the past couple of years, capable of generating a convincing synthetic version of your own voice from remarkably little source audio, sometimes just a few seconds of clear speech. A scammer who's collected a recording of you saying yes isn't necessarily trying to authorize a credit card purchase with it. They may be building a small audio sample that could later be used to clone your voice for an entirely different scam altogether. Perhaps a call to one of your own family members using what sounds unmistakably like your voice. Asking for help in an emergency that never actually happened. The exact kind of manufactured crisis that's grown alongside this technology far faster than most families have had time to prepare for. Let me walk you through how this actually played out for a woman named Patricia, 68, a retired dental hygienist outside Columbus, Ohio. Because her experience touches all three of these real risks in a way that a single tidy story rarely does. Patricia had been getting the "Can you hear me?" call every few weeks for the better part of a year, always brushing it off as a nuisance. Sometimes answering with a quick yes out of pure reflex before catching herself and hanging up, the way most of us answer a familiar-sounding question without fully registering who's actually asking it. She'd read the original warnings years earlier, back when they first made the rounds, and worried, briefly, about her credit card each time. Checking her statement afterward and finding nothing unusual, which over time made the whole thing feel like an empty threat she no longer needed to take seriously. That's a completely reasonable conclusion to reach, given what she was actually checking for, and it's exactly the gap this whole video is trying to close. What Patricia didn't notice, because it showed up as a small, easy-to-miss line item, was an $8.95 monthly charge that had appeared on her phone bill roughly 2 months after one of these calls, labeled vaguely as a premium messaging service, a phrase generic enough to blend in with the dozen or so other line items most phone bills carry without anyone reading each one closely. It sat there for 4 months, $60 in total, before her daughter, helping her review the bill for an unrelated reason entirely, a question about a data overage charge, spotted it and asked what it was. Patricia had no idea. She'd never signed up for any messaging service, premium or otherwise, and had certainly never knowingly agreed to a recurring monthly charge tied to one. A call to her phone carrier confirmed it was an unauthorized third-party charge, exactly the kind of cramming scheme tied to these calls, and the carrier removed it and refunded the total within the same phone call, once Patricia formally disputed it as unauthorized. The representative on the line told her, almost in passing, that this specific type of charge showed up on customer accounts often enough that there was a standard, well-practiced process for reversing it, which suggests this particular scheme runs at a genuine, ongoing scale, even though it never touched Patricia's credit card the way she'd originally feared it might. Separately. And this is the part of Patricia's story that I think matters most, for where this scam is actually heading. Her sister received a call about 8 months later from what sounded, unmistakably, like Patricia's own voice, distressed, and asking for emergency money to be wired somewhere after what the caller described as a car accident on the highway outside town. Patricia's sister, understandably shaken, her hands trembling as she reached for her purse, nearly complied before deciding to hang up and call Patricia directly on a number she already had saved, reaching the real Patricia sitting comfortably at home, entirely unaware any of this had happened, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday evening with no car anywhere near her. Nobody can say with certainty which specific recording of Patricia's voice from which specific call ended up as raw material for whatever cloning tool generated that fake emergency call. But the pattern connects in exactly the way security researchers have been warning about: an old, dismissed nuisance call quietly evolving into raw material for a much newer and more dangerous kind of fraud than the one it was originally associated with. Comment down below if you've ever gotten one of these calls and just assumed, the way Patricia did for years, that saying yes once or twice couldn't possibly matter. Because I think a lot of you have brushed past exactly the same call more times than you'd guess. So here's what I actually want you to do, now that you understand both what this call can't do and what it actually can. When you get a call asking, "Can you hear me?" or any variation of a question clearly designed to elicit a one-word yes from a number you don't recognize, don't answer with that word at all. It won't legally bind you to anything, as we've just walked through. But there's no reason to hand over a usable audio sample for free when a different response works just as well. Say "I can hear you" instead, a complete sentence rather than a bare yes, or simply ask "Who is this?" before saying anything else. If the caller repeats the same scripted question again without acknowledging what you said, that's a strong sign you're dealing with an automated system rather than an actual human being, and hanging up at that point costs you nothing at all, regardless of how the conversation started. If you ever discover an unfamiliar charge on your phone or utility bill, no matter how small it looks, sitting among a long list of ordinary line items, call your carrier directly and ask them to identify exactly what it is and who authorized it. Don't assume a small dollar amount means it isn't worth the phone call, since Patricia's $60 accumulated silently across 4 separate months precisely because it looked too small to bother investigating. You have a legal right to dispute cramming charges, and carriers are required to investigate and remove them once you do. The same way Patricia's daughter got that charge reversed with a single phone call once someone actually noticed it sitting there. Given how real voice cloning has become, it's worth establishing a simple, low-tech safeguard with your own family now, before you ever need it, rather than scrambling to figure one out in the middle of an actual crisis call. Agree on a specific word or phrase, something ordinary enough not to draw attention if overheard in casual conversation, that only your actual family members would know to say during a genuine emergency call. If a future call ever claims to be a distressed relative asking for urgent money, and that agreed upon word doesn't come up naturally when you ask for it, treat that as your signal to hang up and call the person directly on a number you already have, exactly as Patricia's sister eventually did, only faster and with far less uncertainty in the moment, since the whole point of agreeing on the word in advance is removing the guesswork from a moment when clear thinking is hardest to come by. And more broadly, treat any call from an unfamiliar number the same way, regardless of what specific question it opens with. Letting it go to voicemail costs you nothing and gives you time to think without any pressure at all, the single most reliable piece of protection against nearly every scam covered on this entire channel. A legitimate caller, whether it's your bank, your doctor's office, or an actual family member, will leave a message you can verify and call back on your own terms, rather than needing an immediate answer to a question that sounds harmless but exists purely to get a specific word out of you before you've had a chance to think about who's actually asking. I want to leave you with something a little different than my usual close, because I think this particular topic says something important about how scam warnings themselves can drift over time. The original "Can you hear me?" warning, as widely repeated as it's been for years, rests on a legal claim that simply doesn't hold up once you actually examine the law behind it. That doesn't mean the warning was invented out of nothing, or that the underlying caution was ever wasted. It means the specific mechanism got exaggerated somewhere along the way, repeated so many times across so many well-meaning sources, each one citing the last, that the exaggeration became indistinguishable from fact. The way a rumor can harden into something that sounds like established truth simply through years of unquestioned repetition. The real risk sitting underneath it, small, unauthorized charges creeping onto a phone bill, and now, increasingly, a stolen fragment of your own voice feeding into technology that didn't exist when this warning first started circulating, is genuinely worth protecting yourself against. It's just a quieter, less dramatic threat than the one you've probably heard described, and I think quieter. Accurately described risks deserve exactly as much of your attention as the dramatic ones, even when they don't make for quite as alarming a headline. Getting the mechanism right doesn't make you any less protected. If anything, it makes you better protected, because you're now watching for the actual risk, cramming charges and voice samples, rather than a credit card threat that was never really the danger to begin with. I'm Henry Collins. Thank you for listening to Henry Collins.